Sometimes the heart knows what it wants before the mind catches up. Sometimes a single moment can change the course of two lives forever. Clara Dawson runs her ranch alone in 1800s Montana. She's tough, independent, and needs no one. Silas McGraw lives as a mountain man, surviving in the wilderness by himself. He's strong, quiet, and keeps to the hills. When they meet at a trading post, something happens that neither expected. Silas takes Clara's rough working hands in his and says words that shake her to the core. "I can already see our sons in the future." Two people who built their lives on being alone suddenly find themselves dreaming of a family together. But building love on the harsh frontier isn't easy when winter storms, dangerous men and old wounds threaten everything. Can two hearts that learn to survive alone learn to live as one? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Montana sky in shades of amber and rose as Clara Dawson stepped onto the weathered porch of the ranch house her father had built with his own hands 23 years ago. The familiar creak of the old boards beneath her worn leather boots served as her daily wake-up call. More reliable than any rooster. She paused, inhaling the crisp mountain air that carried hints of pine and the distant promise of winter, and surveyed the land that had shaped her into the woman she'd become. At 28, Clara possessed the kind of quiet strength that came from facing down storms both literal and metaphorical. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver from years under the Montana sun, was pulled back in a practical braid that hung between her shoulder blades. Her hands, calloused and scarred from rope burns and fence repairs, told the story of a woman who had never asked for help she couldn't give in return. Those hands had delivered calves in the dead of winter, mended broken gates, and held her dying father as he whispered his final words of pride in what she had accomplished. The Dawson Ranch wasn't the largest spread in the territory, but it was honest land, worked by honest hands. 200 head of cattle grazed on grass her grandfather had first claimed during the early settlement days, when Montana was still more dream than reality for most folks back east. Her father, Thomas Dawson, had expanded the operation through careful management and an understanding of the land that seemed to run in the family blood. When a fever took him 6 years ago, leaving Clara alone at 22, everyone expected her to sell to one of the larger outfits and move back east, where a woman might find a proper husband and a proper life. Clara had other ideas. She walked toward the barn, her spurs creating a gentle rhythm against the hard-packed earth. The cattle were already moving toward the creek, their collective wisdom about water and grass far exceeding that of most men she'd encountered. Her horses, a sturdy mare named Duchess, and 2 geldings, Storm and Thunder, nickered their morning. Greetings from the corral. Storm, a steel-grey Mustang with intelligent eyes, had been her father's favorite mount and now served as her primary companion on the long rides that took her to the farthest corners of the ranch. "Morning, you beautiful beasts," she murmured, scratching behind Duchess's ears. The mare leaned into the touch, a simple gesture of trust that meant more to Clara than all the fancy words men in town used when they thought flattery might win. Her hand. Animals didn't lie, didn't make promises they couldn't keep, and didn't expect her to be anything other than what she was. The routine of morning chores provided a meditation of sorts. Feed the horses, check the water troughs, examine the fence lines for damage from the previous night's wind. Each task connected her to the generations of Dawsons who had worked this same land, faced these same challenges, found meaning in the simple act of caring for what was theirs. Her father's pocket watch, which she carried in her vest pocket, ticked steadily against her ribs, a constant reminder of time's passage and the weight of carrying on the family name alone. By the time she finished the morning inspection, the sun had climbed high enough to burn off the dew, and the day's heat was beginning to build. Clara unsaddled Thunder after a quick ride to check the north pasture and headed toward the house for breakfast and coffee, strong enough to wake the dead. The kitchen, with its cast-iron stove and her mother's blue-flowered china still displayed in the corner cabinet, represented the only concession to softness in her otherwise practical existence. She was frying eggs and bacon when she heard the approaching wagon. Through the window, she recognized Doc Henderson's familiar bay mare and the slightly listing medical wagon that had seen better decades. The doctor was a frequent visitor to the isolated ranches, tending to everything from difficult births to broken bones. But it was unusual to see him this early in the day, unless someone was in serious trouble. Clara stepped onto the porch as Doc Henderson climbed down from his wagon, favoring his left leg that had never quite healed right after a horse kicked it 3 winters back. He was a thin man in his 60s, with silver whiskers and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering to judge anyone harshly. "Morning, Clara," he called, reaching for his medical bag. "Everything all right out here?" "Right as rain, Doc." "What brings you my way so early?" The doctor paused, studying her with the careful attention he usually reserved for diagnosing illness. "Just making rounds, checking on folks before the weather turns. Sheriff Walsh mentioned he saw some unfamiliar tracks near the Peterson place. Might be nothing, but with cattle thieves working the territory, figured it was worth keeping an eye on the more remote spreads." Clara felt a familiar tightness in her chest at the mention of cattle rustlers. The previous year, the Mitchell Ranch had lost nearly 50 head to thieves who struck in the night and disappeared into the vast wilderness before anyone could track them. For a small operation like hers, such a loss could mean the difference between making it through the winter and losing everything her family had built. "Appreciate the warning, Doc. I'll keep my eyes open. You might consider getting some help." "Around here, Clara, young Jimmy Patterson's been asking after work, and he's got good sense about him." Clara had known Jimmy Patterson since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, and while he was indeed a good young man with strong shoulders and an honest face, she also recognized the way he looked at her during Sunday services. The boy, man now, she supposed at 24, had been sweet on her for years, though he'd never found the courage to speak his intentions directly. Hiring him would send the wrong message to both Jimmy and the rest of the community. "I manage fine on my own, Doc." "Always have." Dr. Henderson nodded, but she caught the slight frown that creased his weathered features. He'd been her father's friend and had delivered her into this world 28 years ago. If anyone understood the stubborn streak that ran through Dawson blood, it was him. "Independence is a fine quality, Clara, but even the strongest horse needs help pulling a heavy load sometimes." After the doctor left, Clara stood on her porch for a long moment, watching his wagon disappear over the ridge. The isolation that usually felt like freedom suddenly seemed more like vulnerability. 200 head of cattle represented years of careful breeding and patient work. Losing them would mean losing everything. And despite her confident words to Doc Henderson, she knew that one woman alone might not be enough to protect what mattered most. The afternoon brought Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, Jimmy's mother, and the closest thing Clara had to female companionship in the scattered community. Eleanor was a robust woman in her 50s who managed her own household, helped deliver babies throughout the territory, and somehow found time to keep track of everyone's business with the thoroughness of a dedicated scholar. "Afternoon, dear," Eleanor called as she climbed down from her small buggy. "Thought I'd stop by with some of that apple butter you liked so much." Clara smiled genuinely for the first time that day. Eleanor Patterson had been her mother's closest friend, and her visits always brought a warmth that Clara rarely acknowledged she missed. "Come in, Mrs. Patterson. I'll put coffee on." They settled at the kitchen table, and Eleanor's sharp eyes took in every detail of the room, from the stack of unpaid bills on the counter to the rifle that now hung above the door where her father's family photograph used to reside. "Heard Doc Henderson was by this morning," Eleanor said, spooning sugar into her coffee. Something about cattle thieves? Just a precaution. Unfamiliar tracks near the Peterson place, nothing more. Eleanor's non-committal sound carried volumes of unspoken concern. You know, Jimmy's been helping the Andersons with their harvest. Strong back on that boy, and he's got a good head for ranch work. I'm sure he does, Clara replied carefully, recognizing the careful matchmaking in Eleanor's tone. He asks after, "You regular, you know? Worried about you being out here all alone?" Clara set down her coffee cup with enough force to rattle the saucer. "I'm not alone, Mrs. Patterson. I have the horses, the cattle, and more work than I can handle. That's company enough for any reasonable person." Eleanor studied her with the same penetrating gaze her son had inherited. "Being strong doesn't mean being solitary, Clara. Your parents didn't raise you to live like a hermit. My parents raised me to take care of myself and what's mine. That's exactly what I'm doing." The older woman reached across the table and covered Clara's work-roughened hand with her own softer one. "Child, there's a difference between taking care of yourself and cutting yourself off from the possibility of happiness. Your mother, God rest her soul, would want you to have what she had. A partner, a family, a reason to build something bigger than just survival." After Eleanor left, Clara found herself standing in her parents' old bedroom, staring at the jewelry box on her mother's dressing table. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, lay her mother's wedding ring, a simple gold band that had represented 25 years of partnership, love, and shared dreams. Clara had never tried it on, never even held it for more than the few seconds required to dust the box, as if touching it might somehow commit her to a path she wasn't ready to walk. The evening brought its own rituals. Clara checked the livestock one final time, secured the barn, and returned to the house as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The kitchen felt larger somehow, more empty than it had during her father's time. She ate her simple supper of bread, cheese, and leftover bacon standing at the counter, watching through the window as the last light faded from the western mountains. Tomorrow would bring the monthly trip to Fletcher's trading post, a journey that required the better part of a day, but provided the necessary supplies and occasional news from the outside world. She would need to leave early, complete her business efficiently, and return before dark, a routine she had perfected over the years of managing the ranch alone. As Clara prepared for bed, she paused at the window that faced toward the distant mountains. Somewhere in those peaks and valleys lived the hermits, prospectors, and mountain men who had chosen complete isolation over the complications of civilized society. She had always wondered what drove a person to such extremes, what pain or disappointment had convinced them that solitude was preferable to the messy business of human connection. The irony wasn't lost on her that she might be asking herself the same question. Her father's pocket watch ticked steadily from the nightstand, marking time's passage with mechanical precision. 28 years old, no husband, no children, no clear path toward anything. Beyond the daily requirements of keeping the ranch running, the Dawson name would die with her unless something changed, unless she found the courage to risk the independence she had fought so hard to maintain. But tomorrow would bring its own challenges and its own possibilities. For now, it was enough to have survived another day, to have kept faith with the land and the legacy her father had entrusted to her care. The morning would bring new decisions, new choices between safety and risk, between the known hardships of solitude and the uncertain promises of something more. Clara blew out the lamp and settled into sleep, unaware that her next visit to Fletcher's trading post would change everything she thought she knew about her own heart, her own future, and the possibility that sometimes the most unexpected encounters carried the power to transform a life built on careful isolation into something far more complex and infinitely more meaningful. The morning air held the sharp bite of coming autumn as Clara loaded her wagon for the monthly journey to Fletcher's trading post. Storm stamped impatiently in, The traces, his breath forming small clouds in the cool dawn light. The list in Clara's vest pocket contained the usual necessities: salt, coffee, ammunition, and a few yards of sturdy fabric to patch the holes that winter would inevitably tear in her work clothes. Fletcher's trading post sat at the confluence of three mountain trails, making it the natural gathering place for the scattered inhabitants of the high country. Trappers, prospectors, ranchers, and the occasional traveler from back east all converged there to trade goods, share news, and enjoy the rare pleasure of human conversation. The post itself was a sturdy log structure that had weathered 20 Montana winters, with a wide porch that encouraged lingering and a stone chimney that promised warmth against the mountain cold. The journey took Clara through some of the most beautiful country God had ever created. Pine-covered slopes rose on either side of the winding trail, their peaks dusted with the season's first snow. Eagles circled overhead, riding the thermal currents with an effortless grace that Clara envied. The solitude that surrounded her felt companionable rather than lonely. The mountains held their own conversations in the whisper of wind through ancient trees and the distant call of elk preparing for the autumn rut. She reached Fletcher's just as the morning sun cleared the eastern ridges, bathing the trading post in golden light that made the weathered logs glow like honey. Several horses stood tied to the hitching posts, including a massive black stallion that Clara didn't recognize. The animal was clearly built for mountain work, with the deep chest and powerful hindquarters necessary for navigating steep terrain. But there was something about its bearing, proud, alert, almost regal, that suggested its owner was no ordinary drifter. Clara secured Storm to the post and gathered her trading list, nodding to old Pete Murphy, who was examining a new steel. Trapped with the concentration of a jeweler studying a precious stone. Pete had been working these mountains for 30 years, and his weathered face could tell stories of winters that had broken lesser men. "Morning, Pete. How's the trapping looking this season?" "Fair to middling, Clara girl. Beaver signs good. Up Willow Creek way, but something's got the wildlife spooked higher up. Could be nothing, could be something worth watching." Inside Fletcher's, the familiar smells of leather, tobacco, and wood smoke greeted Clara like old friends. Sam Fletcher, a bear of a man with arms like tree trunks and a laugh that could shake dust from the rafters, waved from behind the counter where he was weighing out dried beans for a customer Clara couldn't see clearly in the dim light. "Clara Dawson? Right on schedule, as always. Got that good coffee you like, came in on last week's supply run." "Much obliged, Sam. I'll take £10 if you got it." As Clara approached the counter, the other customer turned, and she found herself looking up, way up, into the most startling pair of grey eyes she had ever encountered. The man was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to span half the width of the trading post. His dark hair fell to his collar, and a full beard covered the lower half of his face, but it was his eyes that held her attention. Intelligent, kind, and somehow familiar, despite the fact that she was certain she had never seen him before. He wore buckskin clothing that had been crafted with obvious skill, and every piece of gear visible on his person spoke of a man who lived by his wits and knowledge of the wilderness. A bone-handled knife hung at his side, and Clara could see the stock of a rifle protruding from behind his left shoulder. But despite his imposing physical presence, there was something gentle in his manner, a careful control that suggested great strength held in careful check. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat with a courtesy that belonged to an earlier, more formal time. His voice was deep, with the kind of resonance that seemed to come from somewhere near his boots. "Sir," Clara replied, suddenly aware that her practical work clothes and wind-blown hair made her look exactly like what she was, a woman who spent her days working cattle and mending fence. Sam Fletcher grinned broadly, clearly enjoying the moment of introduction. "Clara, I'd like you to meet Silas McGraw. Silas, this here's Clara Dawson, runs the Double D Ranch south of here. Clara's about the finest rancher in the territory, man or woman. Silas McGraw." The name suited him somehow, solid and unpretentious. Clara found herself studying his hands as Sam continued the introduction. They were large, calloused from hard work, but clean and carefully maintained. A man's hands told you everything you needed to know about his character, and these spoke of capability, honesty, and surprising gentleness. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Dawson. Heard good things about your operation from folks hereabouts. Just Clara, please. And I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage, Mr. McGraw. I don't believe we've crossed paths before. No, ma'am, we haven't. I keep to myself mostly, up in the high country. A mountain man, then. Clara had heard stories of such men, hermits, and loners who had chosen the wilderness over civilization, living by hunting, trapping, and an intimate knowledge of the land that few possessed. They were the stuff of frontier legend, and most folks considered them slightly mad, touched by too much solitude and too little human contact. But as Clara looked at Silas McGraw, madness was the last thing she saw. There was a deep intelligence in those grey eyes, a thoughtful quality that suggested a man who chose solitude not from inability to function in society, but from some deeper need for peace and simplicity. Sam Fletcher busied himself with Clara's order, leaving the two customers to their conversation. The trading post had other patrons. Clara recognized Jim Anderson from the neighboring ranch and a couple of trappers she knew by sight, but somehow the room seemed to have contracted until it contained only herself and this unexpected mountain. A man! The high country must be beautiful this time of year, Clara said, making conversation while Sam weighed out her coffee beans. It is. Snow's already falling above 10,000 feet. Be a hard winter, I expect. You read the signs? Silas nodded. Animals are growing thick coats earlier than usual. Squirrels are gathering nuts like they're expecting a siege. Nature's got her own calendar, and she's rarely wrong about what's coming. Clara found herself genuinely interested in his observations. Ranch work required the same kind of attention to natural signs, and she appreciated meeting someone who understood that the land spoke to those who knew how to listen. My cattle have been restless lately, she admitted, moving closer to the shelter areas earlier than usual. Smart animals listen to what the mountains are telling them. Smart people do the same. There was something in the way he said it, a weight of meaning that suggested he was talking about more than just weather patterns. Clara felt an odd tingling sensation, as if the air in the trading post had become charged with electricity before a thunderstorm. Sam finished with her order and moved on to help Jim Anderson, leaving Clara and Silas standing together near the counter. The mountain man seemed in no hurry to complete his business and leave, and Clara found herself equally reluctant to end their conversation. "You work your ranch alone?" Silas asked, his tone carefully neutral. "I do, have for 6 years now, since my father passed." Something shifted in his expression, not pity, which Clara would have resented, but a kind of understanding that surprised her. "Takes considerable strength to build a life from solitude," he said quietly. "I imagine you'd know something about that, living up in the mountains by yourself." "I do indeed." His grey eyes studied her with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. "But lately, I've been thinking that maybe solitude isn't the same thing as being alone." Before Clara could ask what he meant by that cryptic comment, Silas did something completely unexpected. He reached out and took her hands in his, those work-roughened, capable hands that told their own story of survival and self-reliance. His touch was warm, gentle, and somehow familiar, as if they had held hands 1,000 times before. "Miss Clara," he said, his deep voice carrying a certainty that seemed to come from somewhere beyond rational thought. "I can already see our sons in the future." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. She stared up into his grey eyes, searching for signs of madness or jest, but found only absolute sincerity. The sounds of the trading post, Sam's laughter, the clink of coins, the scrape of boots on wooden floors, seemed to fade into a distant hum. What did you say?" she managed to whisper. "I know how it sounds," Silas continued, still holding her hands with that surprising gentleness. I know it's not the kind of thing a man should say to a woman he's just met, but standing here, looking at you, I can see them clear as day. Strong boys with your green eyes and stubborn chin, learning to work the land, carrying on what you've built." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. No man had ever spoken to her with such presumption, such impossible certainty about a future that existed only in his imagination. She should have been angry, offended, ready to deliver the kind of sharp retort that had discouraged other suitors over the years. Instead, she found herself staring at their joined hands and feeling something deep in her chest shift and settle, like a key turning in a lock she hadn't even known existed. "Mr. McGraw," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "you don't know anything about me. I know you're strong enough to work a ranch alone, but gentle enough not to break a man's spirit with that strength. I know you've got sadness in your eyes from losing your father, but haven't let it turn you bitter. I know you're afraid of depending on anyone because you've learned that people leave, but you're brave enough to keep trying anyway." Each word landed with devastating accuracy, as if this stranger could see straight through to the heart of who she was. Clara pulled her hands free, stepping back until she bumped against the counter. "You're talking nonsense," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't entirely true. Silas didn't pursue her, didn't crowd her space or push his advantage. Instead, he simply stood there, those grey eyes holding hers, with patience and something that might have been hope. "Maybe I am," he said quietly, "but I've spent 8 years alone in those mountains, Miss Clara, and I've never seen anything as clear as I see those boys. Your boys. Our boys." The silence that followed stretched between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Clara was dimly aware that the other patrons of Fletcher's were pretending not to watch this unprecedented drama unfold. But their presence felt distant and unimportant. Finally, Clara gathered her scattered composure and reached for her packages. "I need to be getting back," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "It's a long ride, and I want to be home before dark." Silas stepped aside to let her pass, but as she reached the door, his voice followed her. "Clara," she turned despite herself, "when you're ready to stop being afraid of what you want, you'll find me." Clara fled Fletcher's trading post like the devil himself was chasing her, loading her wagon with hands that shook only slightly, and driving Storm harder than the faithful horse deserved. Miles passed in a blur of confusion and unnamed emotion, and it wasn't until she was halfway home that she realized she was crying, not from sadness or anger, but from something far more complicated and infinitely more terrifying. For the first time in 6 years, Clara Dawson had met someone who saw not just the capable rancher she had made herself into, but the woman she might still become. Clara spent the following 3 days trying to convince herself that Silas McGraw was nothing more than an eccentric mountain man with an overactive imagination and a dangerous tendency toward presumption. She threw herself into ranch work with renewed determination, mending fence that didn't really need mending, reorganizing the barn that was already perfectly organized, and riding the property boundaries with such frequency that Storm began to look at her with something approaching concern. But no amount of physical labor could erase the memory of those gray eyes or the certainty in his voice when he spoke of seeing their sons in the future. The words had burrowed into her mind like seeds in fertile soil, sprouting questions and possibilities she wasn't prepared to examine. On the 4th morning after their encounter, Clara found herself standing in her parents' bedroom, staring at her mother's jewelry box with hands that trembled slightly. She had avoided this room since her father's death, preserving it exactly as her parents had left it, her mother's hairbrush still on the dressing table, her father's work shirt still hanging in the wardrobe. But today, something drew her to the small wooden box where her mother's few pieces of jewelry waited in patient silence. Clara lifted the lid and carefully moved aside her mother's pearl earrings and cameo brooch until she found what she was looking for. the simple gold wedding band that had symbolized 25 years of partnership and love. She held it up to the morning light streaming through the window, watching the metal gleam with the warm glow of well-worn precious metal. Her parents had met at a church social when her mother was 19 and her father 22. By all accounts, it had been love at first sight, the kind of immediate, overwhelming certainty that Clara had always assumed was the stuff of romantic novels rather than real life. Her father had proposed after a 3-month courtship, and they had never spent another day apart until death claimed first her mother, then him 6 years later. Clara slipped the ring onto her finger, surprised to find that it fit perfectly. She stared at her hand, trying to imagine what it would feel like to wear such a symbol permanently, to wake up each morning knowing that someone else's happiness was tied irrevocably to her own. The sound of an approaching horse startled her. From her reverie, Clara quickly returned the ring to its box and hurried to the window, expecting to see Doc Henderson or perhaps one of her neighbors. Instead, she watched Jimmy Patterson dismount from his chestnut gelding and approach the house with the careful determination of a man who had spent considerable time working up his courage. Jimmy was a good man. Everyone said so. He was hard-working, honest, and possessed the kind of steady reliability that made him valuable to any rancher in the territory. At 24, he had the broad shoulders and calloused hands that spoke of a life spent in honest labor, and his brown eyes held the kind of gentle sincerity that most women would find appealing. Clara had known him since childhood, had watched him grow from a gangly boy into a capable young man who helped his mother manage their small farm while contributing labor to the larger ranches during busy seasons. She also knew, with the intuition that comes from years of living in a small community, that Jimmy Patterson had been harboring romantic feelings for her that he had never quite found the courage to express directly. She met him on the porch, noting the nervous way he twisted his hat in his hands and the careful attention he had paid to his appearance. His hair was freshly combed, his shirt clean and pressed, and he had clearly made an effort to scrape the mud from his boots. "Morning, Clara. Hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Jimmy. What brings you by?" Jimmy shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly struggling with how to begin whatever conversation he had rehearsed on the ride over. "Well, I was talking with Ma, and she mentioned that Doc Henderson stopped by to warn you about those cattle thieves. Got me thinking that maybe you could use some help around here. What with winter coming and all the extra work that brings." Clara felt her stomach sink. She had been dreading this conversation for months, knowing it was inevitable, but hoping it could be postponed indefinitely. "That's thoughtful of you, Jimmy, but I manage just fine on my own. Always have." "I know you do," Jimmy said quickly. "Nobody questions that Clara Dawson can handle anything this country throws at her. But even the strongest person needs help sometimes, and I've got experience with cattle, horses, and general ranch work. Ma said she'd spare me through the winter if you had need of an extra hand." The offer was generous and practical. Jimmy was skilled, trustworthy, and available. Exactly the kind of help that any sensible rancher would welcome, especially with the threat of cattle thieves and the approaching winter. Clara should have accepted immediately, but something held her back. "I appreciate the offer, Jimmy, truly, but taking on help means taking on responsibility for another person's welfare, and I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of commitment." Jimmy's face fell slightly, but he pressed on with the determination that had always been one of his better qualities. "Wouldn't be charity, Clara. I'd earn my keep and more. Been thinking that maybe it's time I started looking toward building something of my own, and working here would give me the experience I need." The subtext was unmistakable. Jimmy wasn't just offering his labor. He was positioning himself as a potential partner in both business and life. Clara felt trapped between kindness and honesty, between the practical benefits of accepting his help and the unfairness of encouraging hopes she couldn't return. "Jimmy," she said gently, "you're a good man, and any woman would be lucky to have your attention. But I'm not looking for a partner, business or otherwise. I've built a life here that suits me, and I'm not ready to change it. Because of him, Jimmy said quietly. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. I beg your pardon, the mountain man. Folks in town are talking about what happened at Fletcher's. Sam said he told you he could see your future sons or some such nonsense. The betrayal of privacy stung, even though Clara knew it was inevitable in a small community where news traveled faster than wildfire. She had hoped the encounter would remain private, but clearly Sam Fletcher's discretion had limits when faced with such an unusual story. What happened at Fletcher's is nobody's business but my own, Clara said, her voice carrying the edge that had discouraged other unwanted suitors over the years. Clara, you don't know anything about this man. Nobody does. He could be dangerous, unstable, or worse. All anyone knows is that he lives alone up in the mountains like some kind of wild hermit. And what I do on my own property with my own time is my own concern, Jimmy Patterson. Jimmy held up his hands in a gesture of surrender. I didn't mean to overstep, Clara. I'm just worried about you. We all are. This fellow shows up out of nowhere, says crazy things to a woman he's never met, and then disappears back into the wilderness. That's not normal behavior. Clara wanted to argue, to defend Silas McGraw against the accusations of instability and strangeness, but she found herself without words. Jimmy was right. The encounter had been anything but normal. Men didn't typically declare their intention to father children with women they had just met, and the fact that Clara found herself thinking about those words with something other than outrage probably said more about her own mental state than his. I can take care of myself, Jimmy. I always have. I know that. But taking care of yourself doesn't mean you have to be alone forever, Clara. There are people here who care about you, who want to see you happy. The sincerity in his voice almost undid her resolve. Jimmy Patterson was offering everything that any sensible woman should want: security, companionship, a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. He would be a good husband, a loving father, and a reliable partner in building the kind of life that her parents had shared. The fact that she felt nothing beyond fondness when she looked at him wasn't his fault. The fact that his touch didn't send electricity up her arms or make her heart race wasn't a reflection of his worth as a man. Jimmy Patterson deserved a woman who could love him with the fullness of her heart, and Clara was beginning to understand that she might never be that woman. I appreciate your concern, Jimmy, truly, but I need you to respect my decisions, even if you don't understand them. Jimmy studied her face for a long moment, and Clara saw the exact instant when hope died in his brown eyes. He nodded slowly, settling his hat back on his head with the careful dignity of a man who had offered his best and been gently refused. If you change your mind about needing help, Clara, you know where to find me. After Jimmy left, Clara stood on her porch watching his retreating figure until he disappeared over the ridge. She felt the weight of her solitude more keenly than she had in years, but it was complicated by the memory of grey eyes and gentle hands, and words that had seemed to carry the force of prophecy. That evening, as Clara completed her usual rounds of the property, she found herself pausing at the northern fence line that bordered the foothills leading up to the high country. Somewhere beyond those pine-covered slopes, Silas McGraw was living his solitary life, perhaps thinking about their brief encounter, perhaps having forgotten it entirely. Clara rested her arms on the fence rail and stared up at the mountains, their peaks already white with snow that would not melt until spring. The wilderness up there was vast and unforgiving, home to bears, mountain lions, and weather that could kill an unprepared traveler in a matter of hours. It took a special kind of person to thrive in such isolation, to find peace in the kind of solitude that would drive most people to madness. What kind of man chose such a life? What had driven Silas McGraw to abandon whatever existence he had led before taking to the mountains? And what had he seen in her, in that brief moment at Fletcher's trading post, that had inspired such an extraordinary declaration? Clara stayed at the fence until full darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky. When she finally turned toward the house, she carried with her the uncomfortable certainty that her carefully ordered life had been irrevocably altered by a few words from a stranger, and that no amount of routine or determination could restore the simple certainty she had once taken for granted. The Dawson Ranch would continue to run with the efficiency born of years of single-handed management. The cattle would be cared for, the fences maintained, and the bills paid on time. But something fundamental had shifted in Clara's understanding of what her life might become. And as she prepared for bed that night, she found herself wondering if the mountain man was looking at the same stars and thinking about the future he claimed to see with such startling clarity. The first sign that Clara was being watched came on a crisp morning, 2 weeks after her encounter with Silas McGraw. She was checking the water level in the stock tank near the north pasture when Storm suddenly raised his head, ears pricked forward with the alertness that meant something had caught his attention. Clara followed the horse's gaze toward the tree line that marked the boundary between her ranch and the wild country beyond. At first, she saw nothing but the familiar pattern of pine trunks and autumn shadows. Then, just for a moment, she caught a glimpse of movement, too large to be a deer, too deliberate to be wind in the branches. Whatever it was disappeared before she could focus on it properly. But the feeling of being observed lingered like an itch between her shoulder blades. Clara completed her morning chores with unusual efficiency, glancing frequently toward the mountains, but seeing nothing more than trees, rocks, and the occasional soaring hawk. By noon, she had almost convinced herself that her imagination was playing tricks, influenced by too many sleepless nights spent thinking about gray eyes and impossible declarations. That conviction lasted until she found the carved bear. It sat on her porch railing, positioned so that she couldn't miss it when she returned from checking the south fence. The figure was perhaps 3 inches tall, carved from what appeared to be mountain pine, with a skill that spoke of years of practice. Every detail was perfect, from the powerful curve of the bear's back to the alert expression in its tiny eyes. The wood had been sanded smooth and polished until it gleamed like honey in the afternoon sunlight. Clara picked up the carving, surprised by its weight and warmth. No note accompanied it, no explanation or signature, but she didn't need one. Only one person in the territory had both the skill to create such a piece and the presumption to leave it on her property without permission. She should have been angry at the intrusion, the implication that Silas McGraw felt entitled to watch her ranch and leave gifts without invitation. Instead, she found herself turning the little bear over in her hands, admiring the craftsmanship and the obvious care that had gone into its creation. The carving was beautiful in its simplicity, and it spoke of patience, skill, and a gentleness that seemed at odds with the imposing figure she remembered from Fletcher's trading post. Clara carried the bear into the house and set it on the kitchen table, where it seemed to watch her with carved eyes that held an echo of their creator's steady gaze. She tried to return to her normal evening routine, but found herself glancing at the little figure as she prepared supper, cleaned the dishes, and settled down with her father's almanac to plan the following day's work. Sleep came fitfully, disturbed by dreams of grey eyes and gentle hands, and by the persistent feeling that she was no longer truly alone on the ranch she had considered her private sanctuary. The next morning brought fresh evidence of her mysterious watcher's presence. The gate leading to the north pasture, which had been sagging on its hinges for months, had been repaired with new leather hinges that moved smoothly and silently. The work was expert, practically invisible unless you knew what to look for, and it solved a problem that Clara had been meaning to address but never quite found time to tackle. She stood at the repaired gate for a long time, running her fingers over the smooth leather and marveling at the precision of the work. Whoever had done this understood both ranch work and the properties of mountain leather, and they had taken care to match the existing hardware so perfectly that the repair looked like original construction. "I know you're out there," Clara called, toward the tree line, feeling slightly foolish but needing to acknowledge what was happening. "You might as well show yourself instead of skulking around like some kind of ghost." The only answer was the whisper of wind through pine branches and the distant call of a hawk circling high above the peaks. But Clara had the distinct impression that her words had been heard, and that somewhere in the shadows beyond her property line, Silas McGraw was considering her invitation. That afternoon brought Mrs. Patterson for her weekly visit, and Eleanor's sharp eyes immediately noticed the carved bear on Clara's kitchen table. "Well now, that's a pretty little thing," Eleanor said, picking up the figure and examining it with the thorough attention she applied to anything unusual. "Where did you come by such fine carving?" Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Someone left it on my porch. No note, no explanation. Someone with considerable skill, I'd say. Look at the detail in the fur, and the way the eyes seem almost alive. This is the work of a true artist." Eleanor set the bear back on the table and fixed Clara with a knowing look. "Anyone I might know? I couldn't say for certain," Clara replied. But her blush betrayed her. Eleanor's expression softened into something approaching maternal concern. "Clara, dear, I hope you're being careful. Strange men leaving gifts and watching from the shadows. That's not natural behavior, no matter how pretty the carving might be." "How do you know he's been watching?" Clara asked before she could stop. "Herself, because Jimmy Patterson saw him yesterday evening, sitting his horse up on the ridge above your north pasture. Big man on a black stallion, bold as brass, like he had every right to be there." Eleanor's voice carried the edge of protective concern that had made her a formidable mother to 5 children and unofficial guardian to half the territory. "Jimmy wanted to ride up and confront him, but I told him to leave it be. Figured you had a right to handle your own affairs." Clara felt a confusing mixture of gratitude for Eleanor's restraint and irritation at the implication that she needed handling at all. "I appreciate Jimmy's concern and yours, but I'm perfectly capable of managing whatever situation might arise." "I'm sure you are, dear, but that doesn't mean you should have to face it alone." Eleanor reached across the table and covered Clara's hand with her own. "There are people here who care about you, Clara. Don't let pride keep you from accepting help when you need it." After Eleanor left, Clara found herself pacing the house like a caged animal. The weight of community concern, well-meaning though it was, felt suffocating. Everyone seemed to have an opinion about her life, her choices, and her safety, but none of them understood the complexity of what she was feeling. The truth was that she didn't feel threatened by Silas McGraw's presence, surprised, unsettled, and strangely exhilarated, but not afraid. The man who had carved the little bear with such obvious care, who had repaired her gate without fanfare or expectation of thanks, didn't seem like someone who meant her harm. But what did he want? And why did his presence on the edges of her property feel less like an invasion and more like a promise? As evening approached, Clara made a decision that surprised her with its boldness. She prepared a simple meal, beef stew, fresh bread, and coffee, and packed it in a basket along with plates, cups, and utensils. If Silas McGraw was going to persist in watching her ranch, then perhaps it was time to have a proper conversation about his intentions. She saddled Storm and rode toward the north pasture, where the gate now swung smoothly on its new hinges. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that made the landscape look like something from a painter's imagination. At the fence line, Clara dismounted and called toward the trees. "Mr. McGraw, I know. You're out there, and I know you can hear me. I've brought supper, and I think it's time we had a proper conversation about whatever it is you think you're doing." For several long moments, nothing happened. Then, like a shadow detaching itself from the darkness beneath the pines, Silas emerged on foot, leading his black stallion with the casual confidence of a man completely at home in the wilderness. He approached slowly, giving Clara plenty of and time to change her mind and retreat if she chose. "Evening, Miss Clara," he said when he reached the fence. "That's mighty kind of you, though I can't say I deserve such hospitality for trespassing on your land." "Technically, you haven't been on my land," Clara replied, surprised by her own boldness. "But you have been watching it, and me from across the fence line. I figure that deserves some kind of explanation." Silas tied his horse to a sturdy fence post and accepted the plate Clara offered him. His movements were careful, controlled, as if he understood that any sudden gesture might spook her into flight. "Can't deny the watching," he admitted. "Been keeping an eye on things, making sure you're safe. Heard there's been trouble with cattle thieves in the area. And the gate repair, the little bear. Gate was sagging. Seemed like a shame to let good work go to ruin for want of proper hinges." He took a bite of the stew and nodded approvingly. "As for the bear, well, I had some time on my hands, and carving helps me think." "Think about what?" Silas was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if he was going to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of emotion that she hadn't expected. About a woman brave enough to work a ranch alone, but kind enough to feed a stranger who's been lurking around her property like some kind of lovesick fool. The admission hung between them like smoke from a campfire, visible and substantial but impossible to grasp. Clara felt her heart beating faster, and she was grateful for the gathering darkness that hid her blush. "Mr. McGraw, Silas, what you said at Fletcher's about seeing our sons in the future, that was a very strange thing to say to someone you'd just met." "Yes, it was," he agreed readily. "Probably scared you half to death, and I'm sorry for that. But I've spent 8 years learning to trust what my instincts tell me, and when I looked at you, when I touched your hands, something just clicked into place, like finding the missing piece of something I didn't even know was broken." Clara set down her fork, no longer able to pretend she was eating. "You don't know me. How can you be so certain about something so enormous? I know you get up before dawn to check on your animals, even when the weather's foul. I know you fixed that loose board on your barn, even though it would have held another winter. I know you've been feeding the stray cat that shows up near your porch every evening, even though you pretend you don't notice it." Clara stared at him in amazement. "How do you know all that?" "Because I've been watching, and I see a woman who takes care of everything and everyone around her, even when nobody's watching, even when there's no benefit to herself. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. But marriage, children, that's not just about character. That's about love and compatibility and 100 other things that take time to develop." Silas nodded slowly. "You're right, of course. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Clara. I'm just asking you to consider the possibility that sometimes the heart knows what it wants before the head catches up." Those words seemed to carry a weight of truth that Clara couldn't deny. She found herself studying his face in the fading light, noting the laugh lines around his eyes and the careful way he held himself, as if he were a powerful animal determined not to frighten smaller creatures. "Where did you come from, Silas? Before the mountains, I mean. What made you choose such a solitary life?" "That's a long story, and not a particularly cheerful one. But if we're going to have this conversation, I suppose you deserve to know." He set down his plate and gazed up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "I was a soldier once, back during the war. Led men into battle, watched too many of them die, and came home to find that the world I'd been fighting for didn't much resemble the one I'd left behind." Clara waited, sensing there was more to the story. "Had a wife waiting for me?" Or thought, "I did. Came home to find she'd married my brother, figured me for dead when the letters stopped coming." His voice carried no bitterness, just the flat tone of someone who had made peace with old wounds. "Can't say I blamed her. War changes a man, and maybe I wasn't the same person she'd fallen in love with anyway. So you came to Montana. Came west looking for something I couldn't name. Found these mountains and realized they were the first place I'd felt at peace since before the war. Been here 8 years now and never regretted the choice." He looked at her directly. "Until I saw you at Fletcher's and realized that maybe peace wasn't the same thing as happiness." The honesty in his voice took Clara's breath away. She had expected many things from this conversation, but not such vulnerable self-revelation from a man who seemed as solid and unchangeable as the mountains themselves. "I'm not sure I'm the person you think I am," she said quietly. "I'm not asking you to be anyone but yourself, Clara. That's enough." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and when Clara began packing the dishes back into the basket, Silas made no move to leave. Instead, he reached into his pocket and withdrew something that gleamed silver in the starlight. "This belonged to my father," he said, holding out what Clara could now see was a hunting knife in a leather sheath. The handle was carved bone, yellowed, with age and wear, and the blade, when he partially drew it, showed the blue steel patina of a weapon that had been lovingly maintained for decades. "It's beautiful," Clara said, not sure why he was showing it to her. "He gave it to me when I turned 18, said it was a man's responsibility to protect what mattered to him. I want you to have it." Clara drew back, startled. "I can't accept. Something so personal, so valuable." "You can, and you should. There's trouble coming, Clara. I can feel it in the way the animals are acting, see it in signs that most folks wouldn't notice. Those cattle thieves aren't just random raiders. They're organized, patient, and they're getting bolder. A woman alone out here needs every advantage she can get. I have my father's rifle, and I know how to use it. I don't doubt that, but a rifle's not much good if someone gets close enough to surprise you. This knife has saved my life more than once, and it might do the same for you." Clara accepted the knife with hands that trembled slightly. The weight of it was reassuring, and she could feel the careful balance that marked it as a serious weapon rather than a decorative piece. "Thank you," she said simply. "There's one more thing." Silas stood and walked to his horse, returning with something wrapped in oiled cloth. "Found this yesterday, thought you should see it." Clara unwrapped the bundle to reveal a torn piece of fabric. Blue cotton with tiny white flowers, the same pattern as the dress she had worn to church the previous Sunday. Her blood ran cold as she realized the implications. "Where did you find this?" "Caught on a branch near the creek that runs through your south pasture." "Someone's been watching you, Clara, and not from a respectful distance like I've been doing." This was torn recently, probably yesterday or the day before. Clara felt the ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. The idea that unknown men had been close enough to her property to snag fabric from her clothing made her skin crawl with a violation that went far beyond simple trespassing. "You think it's the cattle thieves?" "I think it's someone who's been studying your routines, learning when you're vulnerable. And I think you shouldn't be alone here anymore." The weight of his words settled over Clara like a heavy blanket. Her sanctuary, the place where she had built her independence and found her strength, suddenly felt exposed and fragile. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time to consider that help you've been so determined to refuse. Jimmy Patterson's a good man, but he's just one person, and he doesn't have the kind of experience it takes to deal with men who make their living by violence." "And you do?" "Yes, Mom, I do." The simple certainty in his voice convinced Clara more than any boast or elaboration could have. This was a man who understood danger, who had faced it and survived it, and who was offering that hard-won knowledge. "In service of her protection, I won't be driven from my land," Clara said firmly. "Nobody's asking you to be. But there's a difference between courage and foolhardiness, and a smart person knows when to accept help." Clara looked up at the stars that had seemed so friendly just moments before. Now the darkness beyond her property line seemed full of potential. Threats and the isolation she had treasured felt more like vulnerability. "If I agreed to let you help," she said carefully, "what would that mean exactly?" "It would mean I'd move my camp closer to your ranch, keep a better eye on things. It would mean we'd work together to make sure your cattle stay where they belong, and your property stays secure, and it would mean you'd have someone watching your back when you ride the far pastures. And in return," Silas was quiet for so long that Clara wondered if she had offended him somehow. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle but determined. In return, I'd get the chance to prove that what I saw at Fletcher's wasn't just the foolish imagination of a lonely man. I'd get the opportunity to show you that sometimes the most unexpected partnerships are the ones that change everything. Clara felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. Every practical instinct told her to accept his offer. The threats to her ranch were real, and his skills could mean the difference between survival and disaster. But accepting his help would mean opening her life to complications she wasn't sure she was ready to handle. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course you do, but don't take too long, Clara. Winter's coming, and with it, the kind of desperation that makes dangerous men even more dangerous." As Clara rode back to the ranch house, the carved bear safe in her pocket and her father's knife secure at her side, she carried with her the certainty that her life was balanced on the edge of irrevocable change. The question was no longer whether Silas McGraw would become part of her world, but whether she had the courage to let him. Clara made her decision during the long, sleepless hours before dawn. The torn piece of fabric lay on her nightstand like an accusation, and every creak of the old house made her hand move instinctively toward her father's rifle. By the time the sun painted the eastern sky with fingers of rose and gold, she knew that pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She found Silas at the north fence line, sitting on a fallen log with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to waiting. His black stallion grazed nearby, and a small campfire sent smoke curling up through the pine branches. He had clearly spent the night there, close enough to watch over her property, but far enough away to avoid the appearance of presumption. "You look like a woman who's made a decision," he said as she approached on foot, leading Storm behind her. "I have." Clara stopped at the fence, close enough to see the careful hope in his grey eyes. "You can move your camp onto my land. The old line shack near the creek would give you shelter and a good view of the approaches to the house. In return, you help me protect what's mine." "And what about the other thing?" "What I said at Fletcher's." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "We take that one day at a time. I won't make promises I'm not ready to keep, and I won't let you make them either. But I'm willing to see what develops between us, as long as we're both honest about what we're feeling." Silas stood, and for a moment Clara thought he might try to embrace her. Instead, he extended his hand in the same gesture he had used at Fletcher's trading post. Formal, respectful, but charged with unmistakable significance. "Partners, then," he said. "Partners," Clara agreed, taking his hand and feeling again that strange sense of completeness, as if something fundamental had clicked into place. The transition happened with surprising smoothness. Within 2 days, Silas had moved his few possessions to the line shack and begun the quiet work of transforming Clara's ranch from a vulnerable target into a defensible position. He moved through the property with the systematic attention of someone who understood both the landscape and the minds of men who might wish to exploit its weaknesses. Clara watched him work with growing respect for his expertise. He reinforced the corral gates with additional bracing, positioned piles of firewood and tools so they could serve as cover if needed, and established sight lines that would allow them to observe anyone approaching from any direction. Every change was subtle, practical, and designed to look like normal ranch maintenance to casual observers. "You really were a soldier," Clara said on the 3rd day, finding him examining the approach to the house from the perspective of someone planning an attack. "Company commander in the 2nd Colorado Infantry," he confirmed, without looking up from his survey of the terrain. "Learned a lot about reading ground and understanding how men think when they're planning violence. Do you miss it, the military life?" Silas considered the question with the same careful attention he gave everything else. "Miss parts of it. The clarity of purpose, the brotherhood, the feeling that what you were doing mattered. Don't miss the dying or the way it changes you to be responsible for other people's lives." Is that why you came to the mountains? To escape the responsibility? Partly. Also because I got tired of being treated like a hero when I felt more like a survivor who'd run out of luck. He finally looked at her, and Clara saw echoes of old pain in his grey eyes. Sometimes it takes a special kind of solitude to put yourself back together after you've been broken by circumstances beyond your control. Clara understood that better than she cared to admit. Her own retreat into self-reliance had been motivated by a similar need to prove that she could survive. Anything life threw at her, that she didn't need anyone else's strength or protection to build the life she wanted. And now? She asked. Now I think maybe I've been alone long enough to remember what it feels like to care about someone else's well-being more than my own. The honesty in his voice made Clara's chest tight with emotions she wasn't ready to examine. Instead, she focused on the practical aspects of their partnership. Show me what you've observed. If we're going to work together, I need to understand what we're facing. Silas led her to a spot that overlooked the southern approach to the ranch, where the creek provided natural cover for anyone wanting to observe the house and outbuildings. The ground showed faint signs of disturbance, boot prints, places where men had knelt or sat for extended periods, and the remains of a carefully concealed campfire. At least 3 men, maybe 4, Silas said, pointing out details that Clara would never have noticed. They've been watching you for at least a week, probably longer. Professional scouts, not just opportunistic thieves. Scouts for what? For someone who's planning a major operation. Your cattle are just part of whatever they're after. Silas knelt and examined a partial boot print preserved in the dried mud near the creek bank. This boot's seen a lot of walking but not much ranch work. These aren't local men who turned to thievery out of desperation. They're part of something bigger. Clara felt cold despite the warm afternoon sun. What do? We make it clear that you're not as vulnerable as they think you are. We change your routines so they can't predict your movements, and we prepare for the possibility that they might decide to move from watching to action. That evening, Clara experienced her first taste of what it meant to have a true partner in the dangerous business of frontier survival. Silas had insisted on cooking supper, claiming that his years of bachelor living had given him skills that might surprise her. Clara had agreed partly out of curiosity, and partly because the domestic intimacy of sharing meals felt like a natural step in whatever relationship they were building. She was not disappointed. The man who could track rustlers and fortify a ranch turned out to be equally skilled at preparing a meal that would have impressed the finest restaurant back east. The venison steaks were perfectly seasoned and cooked to tender perfection. The wild onions and potatoes had been prepared with herbs that added complex flavors Clara had never experienced, and the coffee was stronger and more satisfying than anything she had managed to brew on her own. Where did you learn to cook like this? She asked, genuinely impressed. Had to eat well to stay healthy in the mountains, and after 8 years of my own company, I got tired of beans and hardtack. Silas refilled her coffee cup with the careful attention of a man who understood that small gestures mattered. Also had some help from an old crow woman named Singing Bird. She taught me which plants were safe to eat and how to prepare them properly. You know the local tribes? Some of them. Most of the mountain people, Indian and white alike, understand that survival depends on respecting both the land and each other. The Crow have been hunting and living in these mountains for generations. Made sense to learn from their knowledge rather than trying to reinvent everything from scratch. Clara found herself reassessing her assumptions about mountain men and their relationships with the indigenous peoples of the territory. The stories she had heard in town painted such men as either hostile to the tribes or completely isolated from all human contact. The reality, as represented by Silas, seemed far more complex and nuanced. What else did Singing Bird teach you? Clara asked, genuinely curious. How to read weather signs more accurately than any almanac, which plants could be used for medicine, and which ones would kill you if you made a mistake. how to move through the forest without disturbing the natural patterns that animals depend on. Silas paused, and his expression grew thoughtful. Most importantly, she taught me that solitude and loneliness aren't the same thing, and that choosing to be alone is different from being abandoned. That sounds like hard-won wisdom. It was. When I first came to the mountains, I was running from everything. The war, the disappointment, the feeling that I'd failed at everything that was supposed to matter to a man. Took me a long time to understand that I wasn't running from anything. I was running towards something I didn't know how to name. And what was that? Silas looked at her with an intensity that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. Peace with myself. Understanding that my worth as a man wasn't determined by what other people expected from me, but by how well I lived up to my own sense of what was right and good. And now? Now I think maybe the next step is learning how to share that peace with someone who understands both its value and its cost. The conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of horses approaching. Both Clara and Silas were instantly alert, and Clara noted with professional appreciation how smoothly Silas moved to position himself between her and the direction of the sound, while simultaneously assessing potential cover and escape routes. "Expecting anyone?" he asked quietly. "No, but it's not unusual for neighbors to stop by after supper." Clara stood and moved toward the house, where her father's rifle waited within easy reach. Could be Doc Henderson or the Pattersons. The approaching riders resolved into Jimmy Patterson and his younger brother Tom, both mounted on horses that showed signs of having been ridden hard. Jimmy's face was grim as he dismounted, and Tom, normally cheerful and talkative, looked pale and shaken. "Evening, Clara. Mr. McGraw." Jimmy nodded politely to Silas, though Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. "Sorry to bother you so late, but we've got trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Someone hit the Anderson place last night, took 30 head of cattle and burned the barn. John Anderson tried to stop them and got a bullet in the shoulder for his trouble. He'd live, but Doc Henderson says it was close." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. The Anderson ranch was less than 10 miles away, and John Anderson was known as one of the most capable ranchers in the territory. If organized thieves could strike successfully at his operation, no one was safe. "How many men?" Silas asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to gathering intelligence in dangerous situations. "John says at least 6, maybe more. They knew exactly where to hit and how to get out fast. Weren't just rustlers, they were organized like a military unit." Silas and Clara exchanged glances, and Clara saw her own fears reflected in his grey eyes. The threat they had been preparing for was no longer theoretical. The men who had been watching her ranch were part of something larger and more dangerous than simple cattle theft. "There's more," Tom Patterson said, speaking for the first time since their arrival. "Sheriff Walsh is organizing a posse to track them down. He's asking all able-bodied men to join up and help." Clara saw Jimmy's dilemma immediately. As the eldest son of a widowed mother, he was needed at home to protect his family's property. But as a member of the community, he had an obligation to help pursue the men who threatened everyone's safety. "I'll go with the posse," Silas said quietly. "I know the high country better than most, and I have experience tracking men who don't want to be found." "And leave Clara here alone?" Jimmy asked, his protective instincts clearly warring with his recognition that Silas's skills would be valuable to the sheriff's efforts. "I won't be alone," Clara said firmly. "I have my rifle, I know my land, and I'm not helpless." But even as she spoke the words, Clara knew they weren't entirely true. Facing down ordinary rustlers was one thing, but confronting a military-style organization bent on systematic theft and violence was something else entirely. The question was whether the community's need for Silas's expertise outweighed her need for his protection. It was a choice that would define not just the immediate response to the threat, but the nature of the partnership they were still learning to build. The debate over Silas's participation in the posse continued for another hour, with Jimmy arguing for Clara's safety and Tom insisting that the community needed every skilled tracker they could find. Clara listened to both sides while studying Silas's face, trying to read the calculation going on behind his carefully controlled expression. Finally, she made the decision for all of them. "Silas goes with the posse," she announced, cutting through Jimmy's latest argument about the dangers of leaving her alone. "The men who hit the Anderson place are a threat to everyone in the territory, and stopping them serves my interests as much as anyone's." "Clara, that's not—" Jimmy began. "That's exactly sensible," she interrupted. "These aren't random cattle thieves anymore. They're organized, dangerous, and they're escalating their operations. The best way to protect my ranch is to make sure they're caught before they can strike again." Silas nodded slowly, though Clara could see the reluctance in his eyes. "She's right, but I don't like leaving her here alone, with so much uncertainty." "Then we make sure she's not alone," Jimmy said, his relief evident in his voice. "Tom and I can take turns staying here while you're gone with the posse. Ma won't mind. She's been worried about Clara anyway." Clara wanted to object, to insist once again that she was perfectly capable of taking care of herself, but the memory of that torn piece of fabric stopped her words. The men who had been watching her ranch were still out there somewhere, and their intentions were clearly more complex than simple cattle theft. "All right," she agreed reluctantly, "but I want it understood that this is a temporary arrangement, just until the immediate threat is resolved." The next morning, Clara found herself standing on her porch, watching Silas prepare to leave with a heaviness in her chest that surprised her with its intensity. In the few days he had been at the ranch, she had grown accustomed to his presence, in ways that went far beyond simple partnership. The sight of him checking his weapons and saddling his black stallion filled her with an anxiety that had nothing to do with her own safety. "You be careful out there," she said as he mounted up. "Those men have already shown they're willing to kill to protect their operation." "I will. You do the same." Silas leaned down from his saddle and touched her hand with gentle fingers. "Jimmy's a good man, and his brother's got sense beyond his years. Listen to them if they tell you something's wrong." "I will." "And Clara—" Silas's grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "When I get back, we need to have that conversation about the future, all of it, not just the partnership." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "All right." After Silas rode away with the sheriff's posse, Clara threw herself into ranch work with the determination of someone trying to keep anxiety at bay through physical exhaustion. Jimmy had arrived shortly after breakfast, apologizing for the intrusion, but clearly relieved to be able to help protect someone he cared about. "Anything specific you want me to focus on?" he asked as they walked toward the barn together. "The north fence needs checking. Some of the posts are getting loose, and winter storms will finish them off if we don't shore them up now. And I want to move the cattle closer to the house, where we can keep an eye on them." It felt strange to be giving directions to Jimmy Patterson, whose romantic interest in her had been the subject of community speculation for years. But to his credit, Jimmy treated the situation with professional competence, following her instructions without awkwardness and offering useful suggestions based on his own experience. As they worked together replacing fence posts, Clara found herself thinking about the different kinds of partnership she had experienced in recent weeks. Jimmy was capable, reliable, and genuinely caring, but working with him felt like managing an employee rather than collaborating with an equal. With Silas, every decision had been a conversation, every task a shared challenge that benefited from both their perspectives. The difference, she realized, wasn't just about romantic attraction. It was about respect for her competence and judgment. Jimmy wanted to help her. Silas wanted to work with her. The distinction was subtle but profound. "Clara," Jimmy said during their lunch break, his tone carefully casual, "I hope you know what you're doing with that mountain man. Clara set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "What do you mean by that, Jimmy?" "I mean, he's not the settling down type. Men like that, they come and go as they please, and they don't leave much behind except broken hearts and empty promises. And you know this how, exactly?" Jimmy had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I don't know it for certain, but I know you, Clara, and you deserve better than some drifter who'll disappear back into the mountains the minute things get difficult or boring." Clara felt anger rise in her chest, not just at Jimmy's presumption, but at his fundamental misunderstanding of both her character and Silas's. "What I deserve, Jimmy Patterson, is the right to make my own choices about my own life without having to justify them to anyone else. Silas McGraw has shown me more respect in a few weeks than most men show in a lifetime, and I won't have his character questioned by someone who doesn't know him. I'm just trying to look out for you, Clara. We all are. I know, and I appreciate the concern, but looking out for me doesn't mean making my decisions for me." That evening, as Jimmy prepared to return home and his brother Tom arrived to take the night watch, Clara found herself missing Silas's presence with an intensity that concerned her. She had built her adult life around independence, around the ability to function effectively without depending on anyone else for emotional or practical support. The speed with which she had become accustomed to sharing decisions, meals, and conversations with Silas suggested that her carefully maintained self-sufficiency might not be as complete or as satisfying as she had convinced herself it was. Tom Patterson was a quieter companion than his older brother, content to sit on the porch whittling while Clara read by lamplight in the kitchen. Occasionally they would exchange a few words about the weather, the condition of the cattle, or news from town, but mostly they shared the comfortable silence of people who understood that conversation wasn't always necessary for companionship. "Miss Clara," Tom said during one of their quiet moments, "can I ask you something that might not be my business?" "You can ask. Whether I answer depends on what it is. Why didn't you ever marry? I mean, you're pretty, smart, capable. Any man would be lucky to have you. But you've turned down every decent prospect in the territory." Clara considered the question more seriously than Tom probably expected. It was the kind of inquiry that usually annoyed her with its implication that marriage was the natural and expected state for any woman. But coming from Tom, barely 20 and genuinely curious rather than judgmental, it felt more like an honest request for understanding. "I suppose I never met anyone who made me want to give up what I'd built here," she said finally. "Marriage means compromise, sharing decisions, adapting your life to accommodate someone else's needs and preferences. I hadn't found anyone who seemed worth that kind of fundamental change. And now," Clara looked up from her book, surprised by the perceptiveness of the question, "now I'm beginning to think that maybe the right kind of partnership doesn't require giving up who you are. Maybe it just means becoming a better version of yourself, because of the mountain man. Because of the possibility that I might have been wrong about what marriage and partnership really mean." Tom nodded thoughtfully, returning his attention to his whittling. Clara went back to her book, but the words swam meaninglessly on the page as she found herself thinking about grey eyes, gentle hands, and the strange certainty that had entered her life along with Silas McGraw. The attack came on the third night, just after midnight. Clara woke to the sound of horses moving restlessly in the corral and Storm's sharp whinny of alarm. She was out of bed and reaching for her father's rifle before she was fully conscious, moving with the automatic responses that came from years of living alone in country where danger could arrive without warning. Tom was already on the porch, his own rifle in hand and his young face tense with concentration. "How many?" Clara whispered as she joined him. "Can't tell for sure. At least 3, maybe more. They're coming from the south, using the creek for cover just like Mr. McGraw said they would." Clara felt a cold satisfaction at having anticipated the approach correctly, but it was immediately overwhelmed by the reality that they were about to face professional raiders with only Tom's limited experience and her own determination to protect what was hers. "Can you see them clearly enough for a shot?" "Not yet. They're being careful, staying in the shadows." Clara made a quick decision based on Silas's earlier coaching about defensive positions. "You take the corner of the porch where you can cover. The approach from the creek. I'll position myself in the barn where I can watch the corral and the horses." "Clara, maybe we should—" "No time for maybe, Tom. They're here now, and we deal with what is, not what we wish it was." As Clara moved toward the barn, she carried with her not just her father's rifle, but also the bone-handled knife that Silas had given her. The weight of it against her side provided a comfort that had nothing to do with its practical value, and everything to do with the connection it represented to a man who understood both danger and protection. The first gunshot shattered the mountain, silence like breaking glass, and Clara knew that the careful life she had built was about to be tested by fire and blood. The gun battle lasted less than 10 minutes, but to Clara it felt like hours. Tom Patterson proved himself more capable than his years suggested, placing his shots with the careful precision of someone who had learned marksmanship from necessity rather than sport. Clara found her own position in the barn loft, gave her excellent fields of fire, and her father's rifle spoke with authority each time she squeezed the trigger. The raiders, whoever they were, seemed surprised by the organized resistance they encountered. After losing at least one man to Tom's accurate shooting and finding themselves unable to approach the house or corral without exposing themselves to Clara's position, they withdrew as suddenly as they had arrived, disappearing into the darkness. Like smoke blown away by wind. "They're gone," Tom called softly from the porch, his voice carrying the shake that often followed a man's first real gunfight. Clara remained in her position for several more minutes, listening for any sound that might indicate the raiders were attempting a different approach. When she was satisfied that they had truly withdrawn, she climbed down from the loft and walked toward the house on legs that trembled with the aftermath of mortal fear and intense concentration. "You did well, Tom Patterson," she said as she reached the porch. "Your father would be proud. Think we got any of them. At least wounded one, maybe killed him. There's blood on the ground near where you were shooting, and I heard someone cry out when my third shot connected." Tom nodded, but Clara could see that the reality of potentially taking a human life was settling on his young shoulders with uncomfortable weight. She remembered her father telling her once that any decent person should feel such weight, and that it was the people who felt nothing who were truly dangerous. "What now?" Tom asked. "Now we wait for dawn, assess the damage, and send word to Sheriff Walsh about what happened, and we pray that Silas and the posse had better luck tracking down the main group." But when dawn revealed the extent of what had transpired during the night, Clara realized that their problems were far more complex than she had imagined. The dead raider lay crumpled near the creek, Tom's bullet having found its mark with lethal precision. But when Clara and Tom approached the body to search for identification, what they found changed everything they thought they knew about the threat they were facing. The man was well dressed in clothes that showed quality rather than the rough garb of typical frontier criminals. His boots were expensive, his weapons of superior manufacture, and in his pocket they found not the few coins and personal effects of a common thief, but a leather wallet containing more money than most working men saw in a year. More troubling still was the folded paper tucked behind the money, a document that made Clara's blood run cold as she read its contents. "Wanted, Colonel Samuel McGraw, formerly of the 2nd Colorado Infantry," the poster read. "Presumed dead following Battle of Glorieta Pass. Reward of $5,000 for information leading to confirmation of death or capture if alive. Contact Army Intelligence, Denver." Below the text was a photograph that, despite its poor quality, was unmistakably recognizable as Silas McGraw, younger, clean-shaven, wearing a Union Army uniform. but definitely the same man who had been sharing meals and conversations with Clara for the past weeks. "Miss Clara," Tom said quietly, reading over her shoulder, "that's a lot of money. More money than most folks in the territory see in 5 years. Clara stared at the poster, her mind racing through implications that grew more disturbing with each passing moment. If Silas was really a presumed dead Union Army colonel worth a substantial reward, then the men who had been watching her ranch weren't cattle thieves at all. They were bounty hunters, using cattle rustling as cover for their real purpose, tracking down a man the Army believed had died in battle 3 years ago. "We need to get this information to Sheriff Walsh," Clara said, folding the poster and tucking it into her jacket. "This changes everything about what we're dealing with." But even as she spoke, Clara's mind was occupied with more personal questions. Why had Silas hidden his true identity? What had happened at the Battle of Glorieta Pass that made the Army believe he was dead? And most importantly, what did this revelation mean for the future they had been cautiously exploring together? The ride to town took 2 hours, during which Clara wrestled with emotions that ranged from betrayal to concern, to a fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. By the time they reached Sheriff Walsh's office, she had come to several uncomfortable conclusions about both Silas's situation and her own feelings. Silas returned at dawn on the 5th day, riding his black stallion with the careful posture of a man who had been too long in the saddle. Clara saw him approaching from the kitchen window and felt a relief so profound that her knees nearly buckled. Whatever revelations and difficult conversations lay ahead, he was alive and safe, and that was enough for the moment. She met him at the corral, noting the weariness in his grey eyes and the way he favoured his left side as he dismounted. There was dried blood on his shirt sleeve, and his clothes showed the wear of several days spent tracking through rough country. "You're hurt," she said, reaching toward the blood stain with instinctive concern. "Just a graze from a ricochet, nothing that won't heal." Silas caught her hand in his, and Clara felt the familiar warmth of his touch despite the revelations that had shaken her world in his absence. "I heard about the attack. Tom told me you handled yourself well." "Tom did most of the work. I just provided covering fire from the barn." Clara studied his face, looking for some sign that he knew she had discovered his secret. "Did you find the men you were tracking?" "We found them, or rather they found us." Silas's expression darkened. "Lost 2 good men in the fight that followed, and the rest of us barely made it out alive. These weren't ordinary cattle thieves. Clara! They were military-trained, well-equipped, and they fought like men who had nothing to lose, or everything to gain," Clara said quietly. Something in her tone made Silas look at her more closely. Clara saw the exact moment when he realized that their conversation was about to take a direction neither of them had anticipated. "We need to talk," she continued, "inside where Tom can't overhear." Silas nodded slowly, and Clara caught a glimpse of resignation in his expression, as if he had been expecting this moment but hoping it would never arrive. They settled at her kitchen table, the same place where they had shared meals and conversations that had seemed to promise a future built on trust and understanding. Now, the space between them felt charged with unspoken truths and the potential for heartbreak. Clara placed the wanted poster on the table between them, watching Silas's face as he read his own name and saw the reward amount that had brought so much danger to her doorstep. "Colonel Samuel McGraw of the 2nd Colorado Infantry," she said when he finished reading. "Presumed dead following the Battle of Glorieta Pass. $5,000 reward for information leading to confirmation of death or capture." Silas was quiet for a long moment, his large hands folded on the table as he stared at the poster that had the power to destroy the life he had built in the mountains. "Where did you find this?" he asked finally. "In the pocket of one of the raiders we killed. They weren't cattle thieves, Silas. They were bounty hunters, and they've been using rustling as cover while they search for you. And now you know why I've been living alone in the mountains for 8 years." Clara leaned forward, studying his face for some sign of the deception she should have been feeling. Instead, she saw only the weight of old pain and the fear of losing something precious that had been recently found. I know what the poster says. I know what the army thinks happened at Glorieta Pass, but I don't know the truth, and I think I deserve to hear it from you. Silas stood and walked to the window that faced toward the mountains, his broad shoulders tense with the effort of carrying burdens that had been hidden too long. The truth is that Colonel Samuel McGraw died at Glorieta Pass, just like the army records say. He died when he realized that his tactical mistake had cost the lives of every man under his command. Tom Patterson's father said you stayed behind to cover your men's retreat. That doesn't sound like a mistake. The mistake was in accepting the mission in the first place. We were supposed to be a reconnaissance force, gathering intelligence about Confederate troop movements. Instead, I let my pride and my desire to prove something convince me to engage a superior force in direct combat. Silas turned from the window, and Clara saw in his eyes the ghosts of men who had died following his orders. 43 men went into that valley with me, Clara. 43 sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers who trusted me to bring them home. When the Confederate cavalry hit us, we were outnumbered 3-1, trapped in terrain that gave us no advantage, facing an enemy that had been expecting us. But you survived. I survived because a Ute war party found me 3 days later, more dead than alive, and their medicine man decided I was worth saving. Spent 6 months recovering in their camp, learning that the army had listed me as killed. In action, along with every other man in my unit. Clara began to understand the choice Silas had faced, and you decided to stay dead. What was I going to do? Go back and explain that I was the only survivor of a disaster that was entirely my fault? Face the families of the men who died because of my arrogance and stupidity? Silas's voice carried a bitterness that spoke of years spent reliving those decisions. Samuel McGraw was a failure as an officer and as a man. Silas McGraw has spent 8 years trying to find some way to atone for that failure. Clara felt her understanding of their entire relationship shift as she absorbed the full weight of what he was telling her. The gentleness, the careful attention to her safety, the reluctance to push for more than she was ready to give, all of it made sense in the context of a man who blamed himself for failing to protect people he cared about. And now the army wants you back. The army wants to close its books and account for a missing officer. Whether I'm dead or alive, probably. Doesn't matter to them as much as having certainty about what happened. Clara stood and walked to where Silas waited by the window. Up close, she could see the lines that years of guilt and isolation had etched around his eyes, and she understood that the mountain man who had declared his love for her at Fletcher's trading post was carrying wounds that went far deeper than anything visible. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "What I want to do is probably impossible now. I want to build a life here with you, help you run this ranch, maybe even give you those sons I was foolish enough to claim I could see in our future." He touched her face with gentle fingers. But wanting something and being able to have it aren't the same thing, especially when there are bounty hunters willing to kill innocent people to get their hands on me. Clara caught his hand and pressed it against her cheek, marveling at the way such large, calloused fingers could be so gentle. The bounty hunters are only a problem if someone turns you in. As long as your secret is safe, you're just another mountain man who helped his neighbor during troubled times. Clara, $5,000 is more money than most people in this territory see in a lifetime. Even good people might be tempted by that kind of reward, especially if they convinced themselves they were doing their patriotic duty. Then we make sure they don't get the chance to be tempted. Silas looked at her with something approaching amazement. "You're talking about concealing a federal fugitive. That's a serious crime, Clara. And if you're caught, you could face prison. Or worse, I'm talking about protecting the man I love from people who want to use him for purposes that have nothing to do with justice or what's right." The words were out before Clara realized she was going to say them, and she saw in Silas's expression the same surprise she felt at her own declaration. She had spent weeks being cautious, taking things one day at a time, refusing to make promises she wasn't ready to keep. Now, faced with the possibility of losing him, she found herself ready to risk everything for the future they had been imagining. Together. Clara, don't you dare try to talk me out of this, Silas McGraw or Samuel McGraw or whoever you want to be. I've made my choice, and it's you. It's us, whatever that means and whatever it costs. Silas pulled her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of a man who had given up hope of ever finding happiness and suddenly discovered it within reach. Clara felt the strength of him, the solid reality of his presence, and knew that she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. "I love you too," he whispered against her hair, "more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone after what I've done." They held each other in the morning light that streamed through her kitchen window, two people who had found in each other the missing pieces of themselves. But even as Clara savored the moment of connection and commitment, she was aware that their problems were far from solved. "We need a plan," she said finally, pulling back to look into his eyes. "Those bounty hunters aren't going to give up, and word about the reward is probably already spreading through the territory. I could disappear again, go deeper into the mountains, maybe head north into Canada, where the Army's authority doesn't reach. And leave me here to wonder for the rest of my life whether you're alive or dead. That's not a solution, Silas. That's just another kind of ending." "Then what do you suggest?" Clara had been thinking about this question since she first saw the wanted poster, and she had come to a conclusion that was both simple and terrifying in its implications. "We fight. We stay here, build the life we want, and deal with whatever threats come our way. Together." "Clara, that's not realistic. We can't fight the United States Army." "Maybe not, but we can fight bounty hunters, and we can make it clear to anyone else who might be tempted by that reward money that they'll have to go through both of us to collect it." Silas was quiet for a long moment, and Clara could see him weighing the dangers against the possibilities, calculating odds and assessing risks with the tactical mind that had made him a successful military officer. "It would mean turning your ranch into a fortress," he said finally. "It would mean being constantly alert, never fully safe, always ready for the next attack." "Then that's what we do. I'd rather live dangerously with you than safely without you. And if we're wrong, if the Army decides to send soldiers instead of relying on bounty hunters?" Clara had considered that possibility too, and her answer came from a place of certainty that surprised her with its depth. "Then we face that when it happens. But I won't let fear of what might be destroy what we have right now." Silas studied, her face with the intensity of a man trying to memorize every detail, and Clara saw the moment when his own fear gave way to the same determination that had carried her through 6 years of running a ranch alone. "All right," he said. "We stay, we fight, and we build something worth fighting for." Clara reached into her jewelry box and withdrew her mother's wedding ring, the simple gold band that had symbolized 25 years of partnership and love. She had carried it with her during the long, sleepless nights when she waited for Silas to return, and now she knew why. "Then I think it's time to make this official," she said, holding out the ring. "Silas McGraw, will you marry me?" The surprise on his face gave way to a smile that transformed his entire expression, erasing years of guilt and loneliness in a single moment of pure joy. "Clara Dawson," he said, taking the ring and sliding it onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly. "I thought you'd never ask." Outside, the sun climbed higher over the Montana mountains, bringing with it the promise of winter and the certainty of challenges that would test everything they were building together. But inside the kitchen that had become the heart of their shared world, Clara and Silas sealed their commitment with a kiss that tasted of hope, courage, and the kind of love that was strong enough to face whatever the future might bring. The wedding took place 3 days later in Clara's kitchen, with Sheriff Walsh performing the ceremony and Tom Patterson serving as witness. It was a small affair by necessity. The fewer people who knew about Silas's true identity, the safer they would all be. But despite its simplicity, Clara felt the weight of the commitment they were making, the conscious choice to bind their lives together in the face of uncertainty and danger. Eleanor Patterson had insisted on providing a cake, claiming that no proper wedding could take place without one, even under such unusual circumstances. She had arrived that morning with not only the cake, but also Clara's mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved and altered to fit Clara's taller frame. "Your mother would have wanted you to wear this," Eleanor said, as she helped Clara into the ivory silk that still carried the faint scent of lavender and dreams. "She always said it would bring good luck to the woman who wore it next." Clara caught her reflection in the mirror and saw her mother's face looking back at her. The same green eyes, the same determined chin, the same mixture of strength and softness that had characterized 3 generations of Dawson women. The dress fit as if it had been made for her, and wearing it felt like carrying her family's blessing into the uncertain future she was choosing. When Silas saw her walking toward him across the kitchen that had become their sanctuary, Clara watched his expression transform from nervousness to wonder, to the kind of reverent joy that belonged in churches and cathedrals rather than frontier kitchens. "You're beautiful," he whispered as she took his hand. "We're beautiful," she corrected, looking into the grey eyes that had become her home. Sheriff Walsh kept the ceremony brief but meaningful, his gruff voice carrying unusual gentleness as he spoke about the commitment marriage represented in a land where survival often depended on partnership and trust. "Do you, Clara, take this man to be your husband, to stand with him in good times and bad, to share the burdens and the joys that life brings your way?" "I do," Clara said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "And do you, Silas, take this woman to be your wife, to protect and cherish her, to be her partner in building whatever life you choose together?" "I do," Silas replied, his deep voice carrying absolute conviction. When Sheriff Walsh pronounced them husband and wife, Silas kissed Clara with the gentle reverence of a man who had given up hope of ever experiencing such happiness. Tom Patterson cheered, Eleanor wiped away tears, and for a few precious moments the kitchen filled with the kind of joy that made the outside world seem distant and harmless. But even as they celebrated with Eleanor's cake and coffee strong enough to wake the dead, Clara was aware that they were living in borrowed time. The bounty hunters who had attacked her ranch were still out there somewhere, regrouping and planning their next move. The secret of Silas's identity was known to too many people to remain hidden indefinitely, and winter was coming to the high country, bringing with it the isolation that could be either protection or trap. That evening, as Eleanor and Tom prepared to leave for home, Sheriff Walsh pulled Clara and Silas aside for a private conversation that had been weighing on his mind since the ceremony began. "I'm happy for you both," he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine concern beneath the congratulations. "But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't worried about what comes next." "What do you mean?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew. "I mean that word about this marriage is going to spread, no matter how careful we try to be. People talk, especially about something as unusual as Clara Dawson finally getting married. And when word reaches the wrong ears, you're both going to be in more danger than you might be ready for. We understand the risks, Sheriff," Silas said quietly, "but we've decided they're worth taking. The bounty hunters who hit the Anderson place and attacked your ranch, they're not the only ones looking for you. My contacts in Denver tell me there are at least 3 different groups competing for that reward money, and they're all getting more desperate as winter approaches." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. 3 groups? Military deserters turned bounty hunters, professional manhunters from back east, and at least one group that might have connections to Confederate sympathizers who never quite accepted the end of the war. Walsh's expression was grim. "Any one of them would be dangerous enough. All three operating in the same territory, competing for the same prize. That's a recipe for violence that could spill over onto innocent people. "What are you suggesting we do?" Clara asked. "I'm suggesting you consider taking that reward money and starting over somewhere safer. $5,000 would buy you a good life just about anywhere in the country. We've already discussed that option, Sheriff. It's not acceptable to either of us." Walsh nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Then you'd better start preparing for a siege, because that's what this is going to become. These men aren't going to give up and go home just because you're married now. If anything, having a wife makes you more vulnerable, because now they have leverage they can use against you." The words hit Clara like cold water, washing away the last remnants of her wedding day happiness. In choosing to marry Silas, she had made herself not just his partner, but also his most vulnerable point. Anyone who wanted to capture or kill him now had a clear target to use as bait. "What do we do?" she asked, hating the way her voice betrayed her fear. "We make this place as defensible as possible," Silas said, his tactical mind already working on the problem. "We establish watch schedules, improve our sight lines, and make sure we have enough supplies to withstand a prolonged siege if necessary. And we hope that winter comes early and hard enough to discourage anyone from operating in the high country until spring," Walsh added. "Cold and snow have been the mountain man's best allies for generations. Might be they'll work for you too." After the sheriff left, Clara and Silas stood together on their porch, looking out over the land they were committed to defending with their lives if necessary. The mountains rose around them like ancient guardians, their peaks white with snow, that promised the harsh winter to come. "Are you having second thoughts?" Silas asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "About marrying you?" "Never." Clara leaned into his warmth, drawing strength from his solid presence. "About the danger we're facing? Every minute. We could still leave, Clara. Take nothing but what we can carry on horseback and disappear into the wilderness. I know places, in the high country, where no bounty hunter would ever think to look, and spend the rest of our lives running, never knowing if today might be the day someone recognizes you and decides $5,000 is worth more than discretion. It might be better than the alternative." Clara turned in his arms, looking up into the grey eyes that had become her anchor in an uncertain world. "Silas McGraw, I didn't marry you so we could spend our lives hiding from shadows. I married you because I believe we can build something here that's worth fighting for. Even if that fight costs us everything. Everything we have is already at risk, husband. At least this way, we face the danger together." Silas kissed her forehead with the gentle reverence that had characterized every gesture since they had spoken their vows. "Then we'd better start preparing for war." That night, as they lay together in the bed that had once belonged to Clara's parents, she listened to the sound of his breathing and tried to memorize every detail of this moment of peace. Tomorrow would bring the serious work of turning their home into a fortress. Within days or weeks, men would come who wanted to take her husband away from her, dead or alive. But tonight she was Mrs. Silas McGraw, lying in the arms of the man who had seen their future sons in a moment of impossible clarity. Tonight, love was enough to hold back the darkness that surrounded their small island of happiness. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering their tracks and blessing their new marriage with the promise of protection that only the high country could provide. The attack came 2 weeks after the wedding, on a morning when the snow lay thick on the ground and the air was so cold it burned the lungs. Clara woke to Storm's warning whinny and the sound of Silas moving with the deadly quiet that meant serious danger was approaching. "How many?" she whispered, reaching for the rifle that now lived beside their bed. "At least 6, maybe more. They're using the snow for cover, moving in coordinated teams like they've done this before." Silas was already dressed and checking his weapons with the efficient movements of a soldier preparing for battle. "These aren't the same bounty hunters from before, Clara. These men are professionals." Clara felt fear settle in her stomach like a cold stone, but overlaying it was a fierce determination to protect what they had built together. She had chosen this fight, chosen this man, chosen this life. Now it was time to prove that her choice had been worth making. They had spent the 2 weeks since their marriage turning the ranch into as defensible a position as possible. Windows had been reinforced with heavy shutters that could stop rifle bullets. The approaches to the house had been cleared of cover that attackers might use. Most importantly, they had established firing positions that gave them overlapping fields of fire across the entire property. "Positions," Silas said, using the military command voice that brooked no argument. "Remember what we practiced." Clara moved to the reinforced window that commanded the best view of the southern approach, while Silas took the position that covered the barn and corral. They had rehearsed this scenario a dozen times, but the reality of facing professional killers was far different from practicing with targets made of straw and wood. The first shot shattered the morning silence, followed immediately by the distinctive whistle of bullets passing close to the house. Clara saw muzzle flashes from 3 different positions and realized with sinking heart that they were facing the kind of coordinated assault that Silas's military training had taught them to expect, but hoped they would never encounter. "They're trying to pin us down while others move to flanking positions," Silas called over the sound of gunfire. "Watch for movement toward the creek." Clara scanned the area near the creek where she and Silas had shared their first real conversation, and saw 2 figures moving with the practiced stealth of men who understood tactical movement. She sighted carefully and squeezed the trigger, watching with grim satisfaction as one of the figures stumbled and fell. The battle settled into a deadly pattern of shot and countershot, with the attackers probing for weaknesses in their defenses, while Clara and Silas worked to prevent any breakthrough that might allow the bounty hunters to reach the house. Clara found herself falling into a rhythm that felt almost mechanical. Sight, shoot, reload, assess, while part of her mind marveled at how easily she had adapted to the business of killing men who wanted to destroy her happiness. "Clara!" Silas's urgent shout made her turn just in time to see a man emerging from the barn where he must have approached during the confusion of the main assault. The bounty hunter was raising his rifle toward her position when Silas's shot took him in the chest, dropping him like a felled tree. But the brief distraction cost them. While Clara and Silas were focused on the barn, 2 more attackers had reached the back of the house, and now the sound of breaking glass announced that their sanctuary had been breached. "They're in the house," Clara said, surprised by how calm her own voice sounded. "Kitchen door," Silas replied. "We need to fall back to the root cellar like we planned." The root cellar had been Clara's father's addition to the house, a practical storage space that had been reinforced during their preparations to serve as a final defensive position. It had only one entrance, which could be easily defended, and thick stone walls that would stop even rifle bullets. Clara and Silas moved toward the cellar with the coordination they had practiced, covering each other's movement while maintaining awareness of threats from multiple directions. Clara heard footsteps in her kitchen, the sound of furniture being overturned, and angry voices discussing the best way to flush them out of their positions. They reached the cellar door just as the first bounty hunter appeared at the top of the stairs, leading from the kitchen. Clara's shot sent him tumbling backward, but she could hear more men moving above them, searching for the entrance to their refuge. "How long can we hold them off?" Clara asked as they settled into defensive positions behind barrels and crates. "Depends on how patient they are and how much ammunition they brought." Silas checked his remaining cartridges with the practiced efficiency of a man who had fought too many battles to waste motion on unnecessary gestures. "But Clara, if they decide to burn the house—" "They won't," Clara interrupted with more certainty than she felt. "They need you alive to collect the full reward. A burned corpse won't convince the army that they've found Colonel Samuel McGraw." Silas nodded, but Clara could see the tactical mind working behind his eyes, calculating odds and assessing possibilities that she didn't want to consider. The sound of footsteps directly overhead told them that the bounty hunters had found the kitchen entrance to the root cellar. Clara heard muffled conversation, then the distinctive sound of someone testing the strength of the wooden door that was their only barrier against the men who wanted to destroy their life together. "McGraw," a voice called from above, cultured and confident in a way that suggested education and authority. "This is Captain Marcus Thornton, formerly of the Confederate States Army. I think it's time we had a civilized conversation." Silas's entire body went rigid at the name, and Clara saw something that might have been recognition or old hatred flicker across his face. "You know him," she whispered. "I know of him. Intelligence officer who specialized in interrogating captured Union soldiers. If he's here, this isn't just about bounty money anymore." "What do you mean?" "I mean some people never accepted that the war was over, and they've been waiting 8 years for a chance to settle old scores." The voice from above continued, taking on the tone of a man accustomed to having his words carry weight. "I know you're down there, Colonel McGraw, and I know you have your new bride with you. Such a touching story. The dead war hero, finding love in the wilderness. It almost makes one believe in redemption, doesn't it?" Clara felt cold fingers of fear wrap around her heart. If Thornton knew about their marriage, he had sources of information that went beyond simple bounty hunting. "Here's what's going to happen, Colonel. You're going to surrender yourself voluntarily, and in exchange, I'll guarantee that your wife remains unharmed. She can return to her quiet life of ranching, and you can face whatever justice the Army deems appropriate for deserters and cowards." "I'm not a deserter," Silas called back, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded soldiers in battle. "No? Then what would you call abandoning your post and letting the Army believe you were dead? What would you call failing to report for duty while your country continued to need your service?" Clara saw the words hit Silas like physical blows, reopening wounds that had never fully healed. This man, Thornton, understood exactly how to exploit the guilt and self-doubt that had driven Silas into 8 years of isolation. "The war is over. Thornton, whatever grievances you think you have, they died at Appomattox, did they? Tell that to the families of the men you got killed through your incompetence. Tell that to the widows and orphans who paid the price for your arrogance and poor judgment." Clara reached for Silas's hand, feeling the tremor of old pain that ran through him at Thornton's words. She had married a man who carried the weight of 43 deaths, and now that burden was being used as a weapon against him. "He's trying to manipulate you," she whispered. "Don't let him." But Clara could see that Thornton's words were finding their target. Silas was withdrawing into the place of guilt and self-recrimination that had driven him to fake his own death, and she felt the possibility of losing him not to bullets, but to the ghosts that had haunted him for 8 years. "Silas," she said, firmly, using the name he had chosen for himself rather than the military rank that carried so much pain. "Look at me." When he turned, Clara saw in his grey eyes the man who had carved her a wooden bear, who had repaired her gait without expecting thanks, who had declared his love for her with impossible certainty at Fletcher's trading post. "I don't care what happened 8 years ago," she said, loud enough for Thornton to hear. "I don't care about battles lost, or men who died, or mistakes that can't be undone. I care about the man you are now, the life we're building together, and the future we chose when we spoke our vows. Clara, no, you listen to me, Silas McGraw. You are not the same man who led those soldiers into battle. You're not responsible for decisions made by a younger, different person, in circumstances you can barely remember. You are my husband, my partner, and the father of the children we're going to have together. Above them," Thornton's voice took, on an edge of impatience. "How touching, but sentiment won't change the facts, Colonel. You have exactly 2 minutes to surrender yourself, or I'll be forced to take more direct action to extract you from your hole." Clara made a decision that surprised her with its clarity and determination. "Captain Thornton," she called, "this is Clara McGraw, and I have a counter-proposal." "Clara, no." Silas started, but she silenced him with a look that carried all. The authority of a woman who had run a ranch alone for 6 years. I'm listening, Mrs. McGraw. You want my husband because of something that happened 8 years ago. But the man you're after doesn't exist anymore. Samuel McGraw died at Glorieta. Pass, just like the army records say. The man down here with me is Silas McGraw, mountain man, rancher, and my husband. Semantics won't change the reward money, Mom. Maybe not. But jurisdiction might. Clara felt pieces of an idea clicking into place, born of desperation, but grounded in the practical knowledge that had allowed her to survive and thrive in territory where legal authority was often ambiguous. You're on private property, Captain Thornton, threatening United States citizens in their own home. That makes you the criminal here, not us. She heard Thornton laugh, a sound without humor. Pretty words, but they won't stop bullets. Maybe not, but they might stop you from collecting your reward. Clara was improvising now, building an argument from hope and determination rather than legal knowledge. How exactly do you plan to prove that you've captured Colonel Samuel McGraw when there are no witnesses to confirm his identity except the wife who'll testify that her husband is someone completely different? The silence from above stretched long enough for Clara to hope that her words were having some effect. When Thornton spoke again, his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. The army has ways of confirming identity. Mrs. McGraw does it based on what? A wanted poster with a photograph that's 8 years old, the testimony of bounty hunters who never saw the man they're claiming to have captured? Clara felt Silas's amazement as he realized what she was doing, using words and logic as weapons, fighting for their future with the same determination she had shown in defending their ranch with rifle fire. Without independent verification of identity, she continued, all you have is a mountain man who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Good luck explaining that to whoever you're planning to collect your money from. Above them, she heard the murmur of voices engaged in urgent conversation, and Clara allowed herself to hope that doubt was beginning to undermine Thornton's confidence. But hope, she was about to learn, could be as dangerous as despair when it made you forget that desperate men were capable of desperate actions. The explosion of gunfire from outside the house changed everything in an instant. Clara heard Thornton cursing above them, followed by the sound of running feet and shouted orders. Then came a voice she recognized, Sheriff Walsh calling for the bounty hunters to throw down their weapons and surrender. Cavalry's arrived, Silas said with the first genuine smile Clara had seen from him since the attack began. How did they know? Tom Patterson. I told him that if shooting started, he was to ride straight to town and get the sheriff, no matter what else was happening. The battle above their heads was brief but decisive. Walsh had brought not just his deputy, but also a dozen men from town, ranchers, shopkeepers, and other citizens who had decided that outside agitators threatening their neighbors was a problem that required community response. When the shooting stopped, Clara heard Walsh's voice calling down to them. Clara, Silas, it's safe to come up now. We've got them all. Clara and Silas emerged from the root cellar to find their kitchen occupied by Sheriff Walsh and several townspeople, while through the windows they could see Thornton and his surviving men lined up against the barn under armed guard. The sight of her neighbors defending her home filled Clara with a gratitude so profound it nearly brought her to tears. How many did we lose? Silas asked Walsh, his military training making him think immediately of casualties. None of ours. They lost 3, including that one you dropped in the barn. Walsh studied Silas's face with the careful attention of a man trying to read character and intentions. Question is, what do we do with the survivors? Clara saw the moment of decision that would define not just their immediate future, but the life they would build together. Thornton was watching from his position against the barn, his educated face twisted with the kind of hatred that transcended any rational desire for money or justice. That depends, she said, stepping forward so that her voice would carry to where the captured bounty hunters could hear, on whether Captain Thornton wants to explain to a territorial judge why he attacked a ranch, killed livestock, and attempted to murder United States citizens on their own property. Thornton's expression shifted from hatred to calculation as he absorbed the implications of what Clara was saying. Or, she continued, he can take his surviving men and leave Montana Territory permanently, with the understanding that if any of them are ever seen here again, they'll be shot on sight as the criminals they've proven themselves to be. Clara, Walsh said quietly, that's not exactly legal. Neither was what they did here today, Sheriff, but sometimes frontier justice is the kind that works best for frontier problems. She walked close enough to Thornton that she could see the rage and frustration in his eyes, but also the dawning realization that his carefully planned operation had collapsed into complete failure. Here's what's going to happen, Captain, she said, using his military title with deliberate mockery. You're going to take your men and leave. You're going to spread the word that Colonel Samuel McGraw died at Glorietta Pass, exactly like the Army records say, and that anyone who comes looking for him in Montana Territory will find nothing but graves and disappointed bounty hunters. And if I refuse, then you'll face territorial justice for attempted murder, destruction of property, and conspiracy to commit crimes against United States citizens. I'm sure the judge will be very interested in your story about Confederate officers seeking revenge 8 years after the war officially ended. Clara saw the moment when Thornton realized that his choices had been reduced to accepting defeat or facing legal consequences that would be far worse than the loss of reward money. This isn't over, he said, but the words carried no conviction. Yes, it is, Clara replied firmly. It's been over since Appomattox, Captain. You just didn't want to admit it. 2 hours later, Clara and Silas stood on their porch watching Thornton and his surviving men ride away toward the territorial border, their retreat observed by armed citizens who would ensure they kept traveling until they were well beyond Montana's boundaries. It's really over? Clara asked, hardly daring to believe that the threat that had haunted their early marriage might actually be resolved. This part of it, Silas replied. There might be others who come looking eventually, but word will spread about what happened here. Most bounty hunters prefer easier targets than well-defended ranches with community support. Clara leaned against her husband's solid warmth, marveling at how completely their lives had changed since that first encounter at Fletcher's trading post. The woman who had built her life around careful independence had discovered that the right kind of partnership made her stronger rather than more vulnerable. What now? She asked. Now we rebuild what was damaged, prepare for winter, and start working on those sons I was foolish enough to claim I could see in our future. Clara felt laughter bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest, laughter that carried relief, joy, and the kind of happiness that comes from surviving something that might have destroyed everything you care about. About that, she said, turning in his arms to look up into the grey eyes that had become her anchor in an uncertain world. I think your vision might have been more accurate than either of us realized. The hope that flickered across Silas's face was so intense, it took Clara's breath away. Are you saying? I'm saying that come spring, the Double D Ranch is going to need a bigger house and a lot more patience for sleepless nights. Silas lifted her off her feet and spun her around. With a joy so pure, it seemed to light up the entire mountain landscape. When he set her down, Clara saw in his expression the same impossible certainty that had characterized his first declaration of love. I told you I could see them, he whispered against her hair. Yes, you did. And now we get to find out if mountain men make good fathers. With the right teacher, I expect they do just fine. 6 months later, as Clara watched Silas building a cradle with the same careful attention he brought to everything he considered important, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. The independent rancher who had sworn off marriage had become a wife and soon-to-be mother. The mountain man, haunted by old ghosts, had found peace in partnership and purpose in protecting what mattered most. The carved wooden bear that had started. Their courtship sat on the mantel above the fireplace, surrounded by other small figures, a horse, a cabin, a woman in a wide-brimmed hat, that Silas had crafted during the long winter evenings when the snow made outside work impossible. Each piece told part of their story, marking moments and memories that had become the foundation of their shared life. Outside, the spring sun was melting the last of the winter snow, and Clara could see the first green shoots of new grass pushing through the dark earth. The cycle of seasons continued, bringing with it the promise of renewal and growth that characterized both the land they worked and the love they had built together. Sometimes the heart knew what it wanted before the mind. Caught up, Clara thought, echoing the words that had begun their story. Sometimes a single moment really could change the course of two lives forever. And sometimes the most unexpected partnerships were indeed the ones that changed everything, not just for the people brave enough to choose them, but for the children who would carry their legacy into the future. In a few months, their first son would be born into a world made safer by their courage and richer by their love. He would grow up hearing the story of how his parents met, how his father saw him in a vision before he was even conceived, and how his mother chose love over safety in defense of the family they were building together. It was a good story, Clara reflected, the kind that would bear telling and retelling through generations of children who would work this same land, face their own challenges, and learn from their parents' example that sometimes the greatest courage was found not in standing alone, but in choosing to stand together. As Silas put the finishing touches on the cradle that would hold their first child, Clara felt the baby move within her, a reminder of the future they had fought to protect and the legacy they were building. One day, one choice, one moment of faith at a time. The mountain man had indeed seen their sons in the future. Now it was time to meet the first one and begin the next chapter of their unlikely love story.